Eleanor Braddock, 74, was told to move her folding chair off private property, the cracked sidewalk her husband poured with his own hands. She folded the chair without a word. Then the developer, Preston Vance, in front of 30 hard-hatted crew and 2 reporters, said it loud, "Sweetheart, the whole world is moving forward. You're a stain on my lobby." He slid a lowball check across the desk. She just smiled. On her kitchen table sat a manila envelope, thick with county deeds, stamped with a name nobody in that glass office ever bothered to read. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have looked closer, this story is for you. Subscribe before we go one step further and comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far Eleanor's story travels. Eleanor Braddock was 74 years old the morning a man told her to move her chair off private property. It was a folding chair, green canvas, worn soft. It sat on a cracked square of sidewalk her husband had poured with his own 2 hands. She looked at the young man in the hard hat. She did not argue. She folded the chair, slow, and she carried it inside. 2 weeks later, she stood in a glass lobby that smelled of fresh paint. In front of 30 men in hard hats and 2 reporters with cameras, the developer looked her up and down. "Sweetheart," he said, "the whole world is moving forward. You're a stain on my lobby." He slid a check across the desk. A lowball number. An insult in ink. Eleanor smiled at him. She did not take it. On her kitchen table that night sat a manila envelope thick with county deeds, stamped with a name nobody in that lobby had ever bothered to read. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have looked closer, then stay with me. Now let me take you back to the beginning. Kessler Flats sits on the east side of Columbus, Ohio. It is not a famous place. It never wanted to be. 4 square blocks of brick and old maple trees, a corner store that changed hands 9 times, a laundromat that hummed all night. For 40 years, the flats belonged to people who worked with their hands. And for 40 of those years, more of it belonged to Harold and Eleanor Braddock than anyone ever guessed. Harold was a bricklayer, a quiet man with mortar under his nails and a way of squinting at a wall like it owed him money. He came home from the war, married Eleanor in a church that no longer stood, and started buying land. Not good land. Nobody wanted good land here. He bought the lots nobody else would touch. A burned-out double, a weed lot full of broken glass, a corner where a factory once stood, poisoned and cheap. He paid in cash saved dollar by dollar, and he fixed each one with his own back. The trick, he used to tell Eleanor, is to buy what everybody's given up on. Then don't give up on it. She'd laughed at him for years. Then one day, she stopped laughing because she looked around and saw that her husband owned half the neighborhood, brick by brick, and nobody had noticed. Not the bank, not the city, not the neighbors who waved at them every morning. Harold liked it that way. He kept his papers in a filing cabinet in the basement. He kept the family business under an old name, Braddock and Company. Printed on a brass mail plate his own father had screwed to the doorframe in 1951. Harold died 8 years ago. Cardiac arrest in his sleep, the winter after he turned 80. Eleanor buried him beside his parents and came home to the smallest house on the block, a 1-story cottage he'd built her as a wedding gift. She kept his coffee cup on the windowsill. She kept his name on the door. These days, she drove a rusted Buick the color of a dead leaf. It started on the 3rd try, most mornings. She wore the same brown cardigan through 3 winters and darned the elbows herself. Anyone who looked at Eleanor Braddock saw a poor old widow, a woman clinging to a paid-off house on a dying street. And Eleanor let them think it. Correcting people cost her something, and being underestimated cost her nothing at all. So she let them be wrong. It was the cheapest kindness she knew. Every morning she carried a thermos out to whatever crew was working nearby. There was always a crew now. The whole east side was being torn up and rebuilt. She'd pour coffee into paper cups and hand them out and ask the young men about their mothers. They loved her for it. They called her Miss Nell. They had no idea the ground they were digging had her name on it. The county knew, of course. The county mailed the tax notices for the whole block to a post office box downtown, Box 114, a box the family had kept since before most of these men were born. Eleanor drove down once a month and collected the envelopes and paid every one. Property taxes on a dozen parcels. She wrote the checks at her kitchen table with Harold's fountain pen, the same pen, refilled 100 times. She never thought a thing about it. It was just Tuesday. It was just what you did when you owned land. You paid what you owed, and you kept the receipts, and you didn't make a fuss. The brass plate still hung by her door. Braddock and Company. The letters were green with age. A mail carrier read it every day and thought nothing. A gas man read it once and asked if her husband still ran a business. In a manner of speaking, she'd said, and offered him a cookie. That was the shape of Eleanor's life. Small house, rusted car, coffee for the crew, and underneath it, quiet as a foundation, a thing nobody had bothered to see. Then the towers came. His name was Preston Vance. He was 41 years old, and he wore suits that cost more than Eleanor's car. He ran a company called the Vance Meridian Group, and he had decided that Kessler Flats was going to be the future. The plan was a tower, 41 stories of glass and steel, the tallest thing the East Side had ever seen. $212 million, luxury apartments stacked into the sky, a name already picked out. The Meridian Tower. Vance said it in interviews like a man saying his own child's name. He'd stand in front of the empty lots with his arms spread wide and tell reporters he was bringing the neighborhood back to life. Nobody asked whose life it had been before. Vance's people spent a year buying up the flats. They came with checkbooks and smiles and lawyers, and one by one the parcels fell. An old man sold his auto shop and moved to Florida. A church took a settlement and relocated. A family that had rented for 30 years took a check and vanished. The map filled in, block by block, exactly as Vance wanted. Except for one corner. A single lot, 30 feet by 90, with a chain-link fence and a garden gone to seed, and beside it, a cracked square of sidewalk. The lot sat right at the mouth of the tower footprint, like a stone caught in a boot. And on the deed, in a name his people had barely glanced at, it belonged to Braddock and Company. Vance's acquisition team found the widow. They ran her name and saw the little cottage and the old car, and they came to one easy conclusion. Holdout, a stubborn old woman waiting to squeeze him for money. He'd seen it before. Everybody had a number. You just had to find it and be done. So he sent a check. The envelope came on a Thursday. Eleanor opened it at her kitchen table, with the fountain pen still in her hand. Inside was a letter on heavy paper and an offer for $48,000, cash, for the corner lot and everything on it. There was a deadline printed at the bottom, polite and firm. The letter called the lot an underutilized parcel. It called Vance's Tower a once-in-a-generation opportunity for the community. Eleanor read it twice. $48,000. For a corner, Harold had cleared of factory poison, with a rented truck and a summer of his own sweat. She set the letter down. She did not feel angry. Exactly. She felt the way you feel when a child tells you something is worthless because he doesn't know what it is. She wrote a short reply on a plain sheet. Thank you for your interest. The property is not for sale. Sincerely, N. Braddock. She mailed it from Box 114 the next morning and drove home and made coffee for a crew, pouring a foundation 2 lots down. Vance did not take it well. Men like Vance never hear no. They hear not yet. He raised the offer, then he stopped raising it, because his brother told him to. His brother was Marcus, the money man, the chief financial officer, a careful man who read every line of every contract twice. Marcus reminded Preston that the construction bond had teeth. The bond required a clean, complete footprint. Every parcel, secured and titled, within 60 days. If a single lot stayed loose past the deadline, the bond lapsed. The financing wobbled. The whole thing could stall. So make her sell, Preston said. She said no, Marcus said. Everybody's got a number. Maybe she doesn't. Preston laughed at that. The idea that an old woman in a cardigan could hold a number he couldn't reach. He drew up a new plan. A deadline of his own. 60 days to close the footprint, one way or another. And if the checkbook wouldn't do it, there were other ways to move a stone out of a boot. He made a phone call to a man on the city council. He started using a word he liked very much. Blight. Meanwhile, across town, in a beige office at the county recorder's building, a young woman named Danny Okafor was noticing something odd. Danny was 26, a junior title clerk, 3 years on the job, the kind of quiet that made people forget she was in the room. Her whole day was documents, deeds, liens, transfers, the slow paper heartbeat of who owned what. She was good at it. She noticed patterns the way some people notice music. The Meridian Project had buried her department in requests. Title searches, chain of title pulls, 100 pages a day. Danny processed them without complaint. But something kept catching her eye. A signature. On the corner lot deed sat a signature. An old-fashioned looping hand, H. Braddock, with the same steady tail on the final letter every time. And that same hand appeared on other deeds. Not one other. A dozen. Parcels scattered across Kessler Flats, all recorded under Braddock and Company, all signed with that patient looping H. Danny frowned at her screen. The buyer's paperwork treated the corner as one isolated holdout, a single stubborn lot in a sea of sold ones. But the signatures told a different story. She pulled up the plat map, the grid of the whole block, and she started clicking parcel by parcel to see who the recorder had on file. Her supervisor called her name before she finished. A stack of rush orders landed on her desk. Danny closed the map. She told herself she'd come back to it. She said nothing to anyone, because she was the kind of quiet that waited until she was sure. But she wrote a small note on a sticky pad and pressed it to the edge of her monitor. Braddock, check the whole block. The note stayed there. It would matter later. It would matter more than anyone in that building could guess. Preston Vance decided to have a party. That was how he thought of it anyway. A press event. He'd finished the glass sales office at the edge of the site. A shining box with the tower's model glowing inside it. 41 little floors lit from within. He invited reporters. He invited the crew. He invited a councilman. He wanted photographs of himself in front of the future, and he got them. Eleanor heard about it from one of the young men on the coffee route. There's a thing today, Miss Nell, over at the glass building. The boss man's showing off. She thought about it while she washed her thermos. She thought about the cracked sidewalk. Vance's plans, she'd heard, would tear it out. Widen the entrance. Harold had poured that sidewalk in 1978. He'd pressed their initials into the wet corner with a nail, H and E, inside a little square. And it was still there under 60 years of weather. She didn't care about the lot's price. She cared about that square of concrete more than she'd ever say out loud. So she put on her good cardigan, the one without darns, and she drove the rusted Buick down to the glass office to ask a man for a small mercy. Just the sidewalk. Leave the sidewalk. She would even move it herself if he'd let it be. She should have known better. Some part of her did. But she went anyway, because Harold would have gone, and because asking cost less than regret. The sales office was full when she stepped inside. 30 men in hard hats stood around the glowing model. 2 reporters had cameras up, and there in the center stood Preston Vance, tan and gleaming, mid-sentence, arms out toward the little lit tower like a preacher. He was telling them all about progress. Eleanor waited by the door. She was good at waiting. When there was a pause, she stepped forward and said, softly, Mr. Vance, my name is Eleanor Braddock. I own the corner lot. I've come to ask you one small thing. The room turned. Vance looked at her. He took in the brown cardigan and the reading glasses on a chain and the sensible shoes, and something in his face curled. He'd been waiting for this woman to come crawling. He'd pictured it. And here she was, on camera, in front of everyone. Braddock, he said, loud, so the reporters could hear. The famous holdout. Ladies and gentlemen, the one woman standing between this neighborhood and its future. A few of the crew laughed. Uneasy, Eleanor kept her voice level. I'm not here about the lot. I'm here about a piece of sidewalk. My husband poured it. I'd like it left alone. That's all. Sidewalk, Vance repeated. He grinned at the cameras. He was performing now, and he could not stop himself, because an audience was the one thing he loved more than the tower. You want me to build a $200 million tower around your sidewalk. I want you to leave 1 square of concrete where it is. Sweetheart. The word landed flat and cold. He stepped closer, looming, and the room went quiet. The whole world is moving forward. Everybody in this room is building something. And you, he waved a hand at her worn shoes, her chain, her age. You're a stain on my lobby. That's what you are. You're the past. And the past doesn't get a vote. Somewhere a camera shutter clicked. Nobody moved to stop him. That was the worst of it, Eleanor would think later. Not the words. The silence around the words. 30 grown men she'd poured coffee for, and not one of them said her name. Vance turned to a man in a dark jacket by the wall. Walk the old lady out, would you? We've got real business. The security man came toward her, apologetic, not meeting her eyes. Eleanor lifted a hand. She didn't need to be walked anywhere. She looked at Preston Vance one more time, and she did the thing that would haunt him later, though he didn't know it yet. She smiled at him. Small, almost kind. The way you smile at a boy who's about to learn something the hard way. Then she turned and walked out on her own 2 feet, past the cameras, past the model of the tower with its 41 glowing floors, out into the gray afternoon. She did not hurry. She did not cry. She got into the rusted Buick and sat for a moment, with her hands on the wheel. And then she drove home, slow, past every lot her husband had bought when the world had given up on it. That night the porch light caught the brass plate by her door. Braddock and Company. She touched it on her way inside, the way she always did, without thinking. Then she stopped. She stood in the dark with her fingers on the cold letters, and for the first time in a long time, she thought about what the name actually meant. The humiliation should have broken her. Vance was counting on it. A woman shamed on camera, a woman told she was a stain in front of the whole neighborhood. That woman would sell. She'd take his check just to make the feeling stop. He was sure of it. He didn't understand Eleanor Braddock. He'd looked at her worn shoes and thought he knew the whole story. He didn't know she'd buried a husband and a son, and both parents, and gone on making coffee. He didn't know that shame was an old visitor in her house, and she had learned long ago to let it sit a while and then show it the door. But the eminent domain, that was different. That frightened her, and she let herself feel it. Because Vance had made his phone call, and the machine was moving. Word came through a neighbor first, then a letter from the city. Official and heavy. The Kessler Flats Redevelopment Board would hold a hearing. The subject was the corner lot. The word on the notice was blight. Declared blighted, a lot could be condemned. Taken, bought out at a price the city chose, whether the owner agreed or not. For the public good, the letter said. For revitalization. The councilman's name was on the letterhead. Ray Doggett. Eleanor had voted for him once. He wanted a ribbon-cutting photo, a shovel in the dirt, his own smiling face in the paper, beside a rich man's tower. He had never once driven down to look at the lot he was about to condemn. He had never checked who owned it. He trusted the map Vance's people had handed him, and the map said holdout. And holdout was a problem to be solved. Eleanor read the notice at her kitchen table. Her hands were not quite steady. 40 years of Harold's work. The corner he'd poisoned his lungs to clear. The sidewalk with their initials in it. A stranger in a suit and a councilman she'd voted for were going to take it and call it progress. And there was a real chance they'd win. Because that was how it always went. The old lost to the new. The quiet lost to the loud. She'd watched it happen to the whole East Side. She sat with the fear a while. She let it be in the room. And then, the way she'd been taught, she got up and did the next thing. The next thing was in the basement. Harold's filing cabinet still stood against the far wall. Gray steel, 4 drawers. A little key that lived in a teacup on the shelf. Eleanor hadn't opened it since the funeral. She'd paid the taxes out of habit and memory, from the coupon book he'd kept in the kitchen drawer. She'd never needed the deeds themselves. Land you own is just land you own. You don't take out the papers to prove it to yourself. She turned the little key. The drawer rolled open with a groan. Inside, in Harold's careful hand, were folders. Dozens of them, each labeled with an address and a date. She lifted them out one by one and laid them on the workbench under the bare bulb, and as she read, the fear in her chest began, slowly, to turn into something else. There was the corner lot, of course. But there was more, so much more than she'd let herself remember. The 3 lots that flanked the tower's main parcel, the ground Vance's people had bought from a holding company years ago, all 3 still deeded to Braddock and Company. Harold had sold them to that holding company on paper decades back, then quietly bought them out again through the same company, a trick he'd learned from an old lawyer, keeping the family name off the public grid while keeping the land in the family. The parcels Vance believed he owned depended on those 3 lots for access, for the footprint, for the whole legal shape of the project. And they were hers. Eleanor sat down hard on the basement stool. She kept reading. And then she found the envelope. Manila, soft at the corners, sealed with a brittle piece of tape. On the front, in Harold's hand, 3 words. Keep this safe. Inside was an abstract of title, a full chain going back 60 years, and a single recorded document dated 1994. An air rights covenant. Harold had filed it with the county the year the factory across the way tried to build up and block their light. It was a legal cap, a recorded limit on how high anything could be built over the Braddock parcels and the ground they controlled. 30 stories, no higher. Enforceable by the holder of the covenant, and the holder of the covenant was Braddock and Company, and Braddock and Company was a widow in a brown cardigan sitting on a stool in her basement at 11 o'clock at night. Vance wanted 41 floors. The covenant said 30. One signature from her would let him past it, and she could simply decline to sign. Eleanor read it 3 times to be sure her eyes weren't inventing it. The bare bulb hummed. Somewhere upstairs the old house ticked as it cooled. She thought about the glass office and the little glowing model with its 41 lit floors. She thought about a man calling her a stain in front of 30 men who'd gone silent. She thought about the 60-day bond her neighbor's son had mentioned, the deadline that needed clean title on every last parcel, and she understood with a slow, cold clarity that Preston Vance did not own what he thought he owned. He had built $212 million of ambition on top of ground that had her husband's name underneath it. She did not feel triumph, not yet. She felt Harold in the room. She felt him squinting at a wall like it owed him money. Buy what everybody's given up on, he'd said. Then don't give up on it. There was one more thing. A newer folder, near the front. The label in her own handwriting because she'd filed it herself and forgotten. A lease. 11 months old. She opened it and there it was, plain as morning. The Vance Meridian Group had needed a spot for a temporary sales office. Their people had leased a parcel at the edge of the site from a landlord listed only as N. Braddock. They'd signed it without a second look. A routine ground lease, small money, one of 100 documents. They paid the rent by automatic transfer on the 1st of every month. 11 payments, into an account she barely watched. The glass sales office, the shining box where a man had called her a stain in his lobby. It sat on her land. And he had been paying her rent for it since the day it opened. Eleanor set the lease down on the workbench next to the covenant and the deeds, and she looked at the whole spread of paper under the bulb. Everything he wanted to take, everything he thought was his. All of it, laid out in Harold's patient hand and her own. She did not call a lawyer that night, though she knew one, an old friend of Harold's who still practiced. She did not call the reporters. She did not drive to the glass office to throw the lease in Preston Vance's face, though the thought did cross her mind, and she let herself enjoy it for exactly 1 minute. That wasn't how Harold did things. That wasn't how you kept what was yours. You didn't shout, you filed. The next morning, she got up early. She made her coffee. She filled the thermos and carried it out to the crew as she always did. And the young men took their cups and thanked her, and had no idea that the ground under their boots had shifted in the night. She drove downtown. She parked the rusted Buick outside the county recorder's building. And she carried a single folder up the steps. Inside, at the counter, a quiet young woman with careful eyes looked up. Danny Okafor had a sticky note on her monitor that said Braddock, check the whole block, and she had not yet found the hour to do it. Now an old woman in a brown cardigan set a folder on the counter and said, gently, I'd like to file a notice. And I'd like to make a request about a hearing. Danny opened the folder. She saw the looping H. Braddock signature she'd been puzzling over for weeks, right there beside a fresh one in the same family hand. She saw a recorded covenant from 1994. She saw a chain of title that made the sticky note on her monitor suddenly feel very small and very late. She looked up at the old woman's face, and then back down at the paper, and the color went out of her cheeks. Ma'am, Danny said carefully, do you know what this is? Eleanor Braddock folded her hands on the counter. Worn hands, steady, now. She looked at the young woman the way she'd once looked at Preston Vance, small and almost kind. Yes, she said. I believe I do. And she uncapped Harold's fountain pen. She signed it slow, the way Harold taught her. Full name, no flourish, the letters pressed down until the ink sat dark on the page. Eleanor R. Braddock, owner of record. Danny stamped it. The stamp came down harder than she meant it to. She looked at the notice, then at the covenant, then at the chain of title spread across her counter, and she felt something turn over in her chest. Ma'am, she said, I have to tell you, I've been staring at your husband's signature for 3 weeks. I didn't know it was yours too. Most people don't read the name, Eleanor said. Harold used to laugh about it. He said the surest place to hide a thing is right where everybody's already looking. She capped the pen. She put it back in her cardigan pocket, next to the folded reading glasses. There'll be a hearing, Eleanor said. A man named Doggett wants to call my block blighted. I'd like it to be public. Every seat filled. Can you do that? Danny nodded. She could. She would. Eleanor thanked her by name. Then she carried her empty folder back down the steps into the cold, and she drove home. And she made a second pot of coffee, and she carried the thermos out to the crew like she had every morning for 11 months. The young men took their cups. They thanked her. They had no idea whose ground they were standing on. She did. That was enough for now. Preston Vance did not know a single thing had changed. Why would he? Nobody tells the king the walls are moving. He stood in the glass sales office 2 days later with a champagne flute in his hand and a scale model glowing on the table beside him, 41 white floors lit from within. And he told a room of investors the Meridian Tower was the most certain building in the state of Ohio. Every parcel's ours, he said. The last holdout is a formality. We've got the council, we've got the bond, we've got the numbers. His brother stood at the back with a phone in his hand and a line between his eyebrows. Later, when the investors had gone, Marcus caught him by the elbow. Preston, the bond covenant. It needs clean title by day 60. All of it. Every square foot inside the footprint. We have clean title. We have title the seller gave us. That's not the same thing. I want the abstract pulled. The whole block. Preston laughed. He set the flute down on the model, right on the plaza where the fountain would go. You worry too much, he said. That's your job, I know. But the old lady's got 1 lot and a folding chair. 48 grand, and she's gone. Doggett condemns the corner. We pour the slab, we cut the ribbon in the spring. It's done, Marcus. It's already done. Marcus put the phone in his pocket. He did not argue. That was his blind spot, and he knew it even then. He trusted the swagger over the paperwork. He told himself Preston had never been wrong about a deal. He was about to learn how wrong a man could be. Across town, in a gray office under fluorescent lights, Danny Okafor was pulling the whole block. She started at the corner lot and worked outward. Braddock and Company. She'd expected that. The notice was fresh in the system. But she didn't stop there. She pulled the lot to the north. Braddock and Company. She pulled the two lots to the east, the ones the developer's own site plan leaned on, the ones the tower's foundation was drawn straight across. Braddock and Company. She sat back. The plat map was open on her second monitor, the whole redevelopment footprint in pale blue. She started clicking parcels, one by one, and one by one they lit up under the same name. Not the seller's name, not Vance Meridian. Braddock. Then she clicked the small rectangle at the northwest edge, the one the sales office sat on, the glass building with the champagne and the glowing model. The record came up. A ground lease, tenant, Vance Meridian Group. Landlord N. Braddock, signed 11 months ago. Rent paid monthly, on time, every month, into a county post office box the family had kept since before Danny was born. She read it twice. Then she reached for the sticky note on the edge of her monitor, the one that said Braddock, checked the whole block, and she peeled it off, because there was nothing left to check. She'd found it. She'd found all of it. She printed the abstract. She stapled it clean. And she set it in a folder for the hearing, because when the county's title examiner asked for it, she wanted it to be ready. The days moved. The bond clock moved with them. 60 days down to 40. 40 to 26. On the site, the crane turned, the crew poured footings, and Preston Vance walked the mud in clean boots and told anyone who'd listen that he could feel the whole thing coming together under him. He never read the abstract. Marcus asked for it twice more. It sat in a queue. The examiner had to certify it, and the examiner was thorough, and thorough takes time, and time was the one thing Preston kept insisting he had plenty of. He did not. The hearing was called for a Tuesday morning. Councilman Ray Doggett convened it in the Redevelopment Board's chamber downtown, a low room with fluorescent light and a projector and rows of folding chairs. He'd meant it to be a formality, a quorum, a motion, a vote to declare the corner lot blighted, and then the eminent domain machinery would do the rest and hand Preston his footprint. He had not expected the room to be full. But it was. Every seat. A junior clerk had seen to that. And in the second row sat an old woman in a brown cardigan, her hands folded in her lap. A green folding chair leaning against the wall behind her, because she'd brought her own, out of habit, and no one had thought to stop her this time. Beside her sat a lawyer. Plain suit, gray hair, a box of files at his feet. Harold's old attorney, retained the way you'd hire a plumber. No drama, just a man who knew where the papers went. Doggett banged the little gavel. He read the motion. Blight. Public purpose. The corner parcel at the heart of the Kessler Flats redevelopment, an obstacle to progress, to be acquired for fair market value, and cleared. Preston Vance sat in the front row, with his legs crossed and his phone face down on his knee. He looked at the old woman once, and the corner of his mouth moved, and he looked away. He'd already won this. He was only here for the photograph. Before the board votes, Doggett said, we'll hear any objection to the finding. Briefly, the plain lawyer stood. We object, he said. And we'd ask the board to review the chain of title before it condemns anything. We've submitted the recorded documents this morning. I believe your own title examiner has them. Doggett frowned. He looked to the side, where a woman with a county badge sat at a small table with a laptop and a stack of stapled paper. Is that right? It is, the examiner said. Then let's clear it up quickly, Doggett said, impatient, wanting his vote. Confirm the parcels owned by the party we're condemning, and will proceed. The examiner did not answer quickly. She turned the top page. She looked at the projector, and the plat map came up on the screen, the whole footprint in pale blue, and she picked up a pointer. "Councilman," she said, "I can't confirm that, and I need to say why on the record. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms do when something is about to happen that no one planned. This parcel," she said, and touched the corner lot with the pointer, and it lit up. Owner of record is Braddock and Company. Recorded 1958. Continuous. Taxes current. "Fine," Doggett said. "That's the holdout. That's what we're condemning. I'm not finished." The examiner moved the pointer north. "This parcel. Braddock and Company. Recorded 1961. She moved east. These two. Braddock and Company. Recorded 1967 and 1972. A murmur started at the back. "Councilman, these are the 3 lots the redevelopment's approved site plan is built across. The foundation of the tower is drawn over them. The board's records list them as acquired by the developer's seller. They were never the seller's to sell. The seller never held title. Braddock and Company has held it for over 50 years. Preston uncrossed his legs. "That's a mistake," he said, and his voice was too loud for the room. "That's a clerical error. Someone entered the wrong name." "It's not one entry, sir," the examiner said. "It's 4 deeds, 4 decades, 4 separate recordings, all in the same hand, all continuous, all paid. I checked each one this week." At the clerk's table, a young woman quietly turned a stapled document so it faced the 2 reporters standing along the side wall. The header caught the projector light. Braddock and CO. The reporters were the same 2 who'd stood in the glass lobby 3 weeks before and filmed an old woman being walked out by security. They lifted their cameras now. Marcus Vance, in the second row on the far side, took out his phone. He did not say anything. He just started to read the abstract on the screen, line by line, and the color left his face by degrees. Doggett was sweating. You could see it under the fluorescent light, a shine on his forehead. He'd never checked the chain of title himself. He'd trusted the developer's word and the seller's paper, and his own hunger for a ribbon to cut. Now the fraud was on the record, in the minutes, with 2 cameras rolling, and his name was attached to a motion to condemn land the city didn't understand it didn't own. "I'd like a recess," Doggett said. "I'd like to finish," the examiner said, "since the board is on the verge of a vote." Eleanor Braddock stood up. She did it slowly, the way a woman of 74 stands, one hand on the back of the chair in front of her. But when she was up, she was straight. She held a manila envelope against her chest. She looked at Preston Vance, and it was the same look she'd given him in the lobby, small and almost kind. The look of a person who is not afraid of you, and never was. "May I say something?" she said. It was not really a question. Doggett opened his mouth. The examiner said, "The record should hear the owner." And that settled it. Eleanor turned, so she was speaking to the room, but her eyes stayed on Preston. "My husband's name was Harold," she said. "He laid brick. He laid the brick under half of you without you ever knowing it. 40 years he bought the lots nobody wanted on this block. He fixed the roofs. He paid the taxes out of a post office box. Box 114, we've had it since 1951. And every deed he signed the same way, and put it away and told me the surest place to hide a thing is right where everybody's already looking." She set the envelope on the rail in front of her. "Mr. Vance," she said his name the way you'd set down something heavy. "You called me a stain on your lobby, in front of your men, in front of these 2 young people with cameras, who I believe are here again this morning." The reporters did not lower the cameras. "You never once read the name on your own lease," Eleanor said. "So let me read it to you now. The building you served champagne in. The glass office, with the little glowing tower on the table. It sits on my ground. Your company signed a lease for it 11 months ago. Landlord, N. Braddock, you've been paying me rent, Mr. Vance, every month. On time. Into box 114. 11 months of it. The room made a sound. A single low sound, 30 people exhaling at once. Preston stood up. His mouth worked. Nothing came out of it for a moment, and when it did, it was smaller than he wanted it to be. We can all buy it, he said. The office parcel. The corner. All of it. Name your number. Whatever the deals were, I'll go to 200,000 for the corner alone. We'll paper the rest. Name your number. The swagger was gone. It didn't drain slow. It fell out of him all at once, like something cut loose, and what was left was a man in an expensive coat with his hands open in front of an old woman, asking her a question. Eleanor did not answer the number. She took the last page out of the envelope instead. She held it up so the projector light caught it, and the examiner leaned in to look, and then the examiner sat back down as if her knees had gone. There's one more thing my husband recorded, Eleanor said, in 1994. On these parcels. An air rights covenant. It caps construction on this ground at 30 stories. Harold did it on purpose. He said someday somebody would try to put a tower on the neighborhood, and he wanted the sky to stay where the sunlight could reach the street. She looked at the scale model that wasn't in the room, and everyone in the room saw it anyway. The 41 glowing floors. You drew 41, Mr. Vance. The covenant is recorded. It runs with the land. Floors 31 through 41 cannot legally be built, and I am told your construction bond requires clean title and a lawful plan by day 60, or it lapses. What day is it? Marcus said. He said it to no one. He said it to his phone. He already knew. It's day 52, the examiner said quietly. Marcus Vance stood, turned his back on the whole chamber, and put the phone to his ear. And you could hear him say, low and even, it's Marcus. Get me the bond desk. Now, Doggett was still trying to be a councilman. This board he started was acting in good faith on the information provided. You were provided a lie, councilman, the examiner said, and she said it for the minutes, clearly, so it could never be unsaid. The redevelopment's chain of title was never clean. The board voted twice on land it did not own. That is now on the record. Doggett sat down. He did not distance himself well. He tried, and everyone watched him try, and that was somehow worse than if he'd said nothing. Preston Vance was still standing. He was still looking at Eleanor. The number was still in his mouth, and she had still not taken it. And slowly it seemed to reach him that she was not going to, that money was not the language being spoken here, that he had walked into the one room in the state of Ohio where his checkbook did not open the door. Name your number, he said again, but it came out like a man saying a word in a language he'd just realized nobody around him spoke. Eleanor picked up her envelope. She tucked it back against her chest. I don't have a number, she said. I have a sidewalk. My husband poured it himself, out front of our house, and he pressed our initials into the corner while it was wet. An H and an E. You told me to move my chair off it because it was private property. She almost smiled. It is. It's mine. I'd like it left exactly the way it is. I'd like this block left standing. That's my number, Miss Vance. That's the whole of it. She turned to Doggett. You can vote on your blight now, councilman, if you still want to. He did not want to. The motion died for lack of anyone willing to second it, with 2 cameras running. The examiner's findings went into the record. The hearing was adjourned, and it did not so much end as come apart, people rising and talking all at once. The 2 reporters moving toward the front, Marcus in the corner with the phone still at his ear and his eyes on the floor. Eleanor Braddock did not stay for it. She picked up her green folding chair from where it leaned against the wall. She carried it under her arm, out the door, down the steps, into the gray morning. A young clerk came out after her without a coat, cold, and caught up on the sidewalk. Mrs. Braddock, Danny was out of breath. I wanted to say. I've never seen anything like that. You made it public, Eleanor said. You filled the room. That was the part that mattered. I only did my job. I know, Eleanor said. That's the rare thing about it. She looked at the young woman for a moment. Careful eyes. Too quiet to be heard, until she wasn't. Braddock and Company hasn't had an employee since Harold, Eleanor said. Not for a long time. There's a great deal of paper in my basement that ought to be looked after by someone who reads the names. When you're ready to leave that counter, come and find me. Then she put her chair in the back of the rusted Buick, and she drove home to make coffee, because it was nearly time for the crew's break. And the crew still had to be fed even on the day the tower died. The tower died on day 60, not with a demolition, with a phone call. The bond desk pulled the financing because the title was not clean, and the plan was not lawful, and the covenant was recorded and public and could not be argued away. Without the bond, the lenders stepped back. Without the lenders, Vance Meridian Group had a hole in the ground, a crane on a lease, and a debt shaped like a 41-story building that was only ever allowed to be 30. 6 months later, the crane was gone. It was spring in Kessler Flats, the kind of thin, bright morning where the light comes low down the street and finds every crack in the pavement. Eleanor Braddock sat in her green folding chair on the sidewalk out front of the smallest house on the block, a thermos on the ground beside her, her cardigan buttoned against the last of the cold. Across the street, the sight was quiet, and then not quiet, the ordinary noise of men working. A new developer had the parcel now, a smaller firm, one that had read the covenant before it drew a single line and drawn to it. 29 floors, lawful, under the sky Harold wanted left alone. The building would go up. It would just go up honest. Braddock and Company had leased them the ground, on terms in writing, with the name read out loud before anyone signed. Harold's sidewalk was untouched. They'd built around it. Somebody, Eleanor was never quite sure who, had set a small brass marker into the concrete beside the pressed initials, the H and the E, and it said only that this walk was laid by hand in the last century and would be kept. She hadn't asked for the marker. She let it stay. Preston Vance, she heard about the way you hear about weather in another town. The firm had come apart. The partners scattered. In the trade papers, a line went around that she thought Harold would have enjoyed. Meridian's collapse was a title problem, they said, as if the title had been the accident, as if the ground had done something to him, instead of the other way around. Ray Doggett did not stand for re-election. The minutes of that hearing had a way of following a man. Someone read them aloud at a candidates' forum, the part where the examiner said the board voted twice on land it did not own, and that was the end of that. Marcus Vance, of all of them, sent a letter. Short, handwritten, it said he was sorry he had trusted his brother's certainty over the paper, that it was his job to read the paper and he had not, and that he understood now what that had cost. Eleanor read it twice. She did not answer it, but she kept it in the drawer with Harold's fountain pen, because a man who admits he should have read the paper is a rarer thing than a man who wins, and she thought that ought to be kept safe too. Danny Okafor left the counter in the fall. She was the first employee Braddock and Company had hired in decades, and she sat now at Harold's old desk in the basement with the gray steel filing cabinet open beside her, learning the block by its deeds. One folder at a time, reading every name out loud the way she'd been taught. There was more ground than anyone had guessed. There was always more than anyone guessed. That had been the whole idea. A truck pulled up across the street, and the crew came down off the frame for their morning break. And Eleanor pushed up out of the folding chair, one hand on the armrest, and lifted the thermos. The young men crossed to her the way young men had crossed to her for 11 months and 40 years before that. They took their cups. They thanked her by name. This crew knew the name. This crew had read it. She poured, and the steam went up into the low spring light, and behind her the brass plate on the doorframe caught the sun. Braddock and Company. It had hung there the whole time. Anyone could have read it. Harold used to say that was the surest place to hide a thing, and he'd been right, and he'd been gone 8 years, and the ground still remembered exactly who had built it. Eleanor sat back down in her chair. She wrapped her hands around her own cup. She looked at the sidewalk her husband poured, at the two small initials in the corner, at the marker beside them. And she let herself enjoy the morning for exactly as long as it lasted. The block was still standing. It would go on standing. That was the whole of the number she'd ever wanted. And if you've made it this far with her, comment the city you're watching from. I'd like to see how far Eleanor's story has traveled. The steam from her cup thinned and disappeared into the morning, and she watched it go the way she had always watched things go, without rushing them, without calling them back. Harold had noticed that about her early on. He said most people watched the thing that was arriving, and she always watched the thing that was leaving, as if she trusted the arrivals to take care of themselves. She had told him that was because they usually did. He had written that down somewhere. She had found it in his handwriting on the back of an envelope years later, in the drawer with the rubber bands and the dead batteries, her own words back to her in his slanted hand, and she had stood there in the kitchen a long time before she put it back. The morning held its temperature. The crew ate from a paper bag someone had brought, passing it down the steps of the frame in that easy, unhurried way that men work when the work is going well, when the measurements have come out right, and the material is sound, and nobody is asking them to hurry over anything important. She had seen that ease before. She had seen the other kind, too. There was a difference in the way a building went up, depending on whether the men believed in the ground under it, and this crew believed. You could hear it in the level of noise they made, which was not very much. Across the street, the corner unit had new glass in the window. Someone had cleaned the brick above the lintel, the old soot gone. And what was underneath was a warm tan color she had not seen in 30 years, the original face of the thing coming back through. Harold would have noticed that first. He had a way of seeing what buildings looked like before the city got to them, the way a restorer sees through paint. He used to stand on the sidewalk, with his head tilted at a particular angle, and she would ask him what he was looking at, and he would say the bones. Always the bones first. She had not been able to see it that way until she started reading the deeds herself, until the pages made the building more than a surface. Now she looked at a doorframe and thought about who had signed for it, whose name was in the county book beside the date, what they had needed the building to do for them, and whether it had done it. That was a different kind of seeing. It was slower. It reached further back. The young man at the top of the frame called something down to the man below him, a question about a measurement, and the man below called the number back up without checking anything, from memory, the way you can do a thing when you have done it enough times that your body holds it. She liked that. She liked watching people know things in their hands. Her cup was almost empty. The sun had moved enough to clear the roofline and was sitting now full on the brass plate, and the letters were very bright. The kind of bright that made you squint slightly, the kind that meant the metal had been kept clean. Danny polished it on Fridays. She had started doing it without being asked, and she had not stopped. Braddock and Company. Established in the body of a man who believed that what you owned you had better be able to account for, and passed through the hands of a woman who had decided that accounting for it was itself the work, the whole of the work, and that the work was enough. The street was quiet the way it got in the pause between the end of 1 hour and the start of the next. A pigeon moved along the far curb and did not startle at anything. The light was the kind that does not last, the particular softness of a spring morning before the day hardens into itself. And Eleanor sat in it with both hands around the cup and let it fall on her face, and did not close her eyes against it. The block was still standing.